What's up everyone, I'm Eldridge and welcome back to my silly, nonsensical, absolutely pointless look at class synergies without knowing what the classes actually do. The beta approacheth, more slowly than some would like it, myself included, but what are we gonna do? So we definitely need some pointless speculation to tide us over until we finally can get our hands on the first playable chunk of the actual game. So just like with the previous videos, we will be having a little once over the classes, just so we have an easier time recalling what it is that all the classes did according to the earlier reveals. Once again, if you haven't watched the other two videos in this series, I am going off of the first spoilers for the classes that we received in 2015, way before the first beta test. So all of this is subject to change and we don't actually have that much of a picture of the final classes, we just have very tiny excerpts of their abilities. Alphabetical is the name of the game, and so we are going to start with the Arisen. The Arisen are of course the Viking scout class of choice, and so they provide scouting for their realm. Unlike the other two scout classes, however, we did get a little bit more of an idea of what other skills the Arisen is going to have. Namely that they're going to have abilities that cause a bunch of panic rating. Again, we don't necessarily know exactly what panic rating is going to do. Your guess is as good as mine. It might be a combat debuff, but whatever it is, the Arisen is going to end up being real scary. They're also going to be able to mark enemy targets, which is probably going to have combat properties, but is also going to play into the visibility system that the game is going to have. And finally, the Arisen can also reduce the enemy's movement speed. So we can actually see that the Arisen has the potential of being rather decent in a group situation. Next up, we have the Child of Loki, the Viking shapeshifter class. As the shapeshifter class, we of course know quite a bit more about the Child of Loki than the other ones. We know, for example, that the shapeshifty flavor of the Child of Loki is to go through their different forms a lot, unlike the Enchanted Knight who focuses on their forms. The Child of Loki can also be real scary and increase enemy panic rating. In their wolf form they can steal a lot of hit points, while in their horse form they have a lot of mobility and are able to reduce enemy movement speed, while in the snake form they do a whole bunch of piercing damage and inflict a ton of poison damage. This makes the Child of Loki great at engaging, at fighting in melee combat, and gives it some useful utility. The resident Viking heal mage hybrid is the Hailbound, and the Hailbound comes with a healthy life and death theme. They can deal death damage over time and drain enemy stamina and blood. Remember that stamina and blood in Camelot Unchained are the resources abilities are used with. Blood for spells, stamina for non-spells. Hailbounds can also heal and restore blood and stamina over time to their group, which makes them sort of the equivalent of a mana battery if you think about it. Furthermore, they can reduce the damage taken by friendlies and increase death damage taken on enemies, which of course helps their own damage. Next up we have the Mjolnir. Now we don't have all that many specifics about the Mjolnir in terms of their utility, but we do know that Mjolnirs are a little bit more aggressive than the other two heavy fighter classes, and they're really good at dealing crushing damage. But they also have lightning magic ranged attacks, which definitely sets them apart from their counterparts. Lastly, like all good heavy fighters, they can deal a bunch of disruption damage, which is always great for interrupting those spell casts on enemy healers and mages. And then we come to the Shadow Walker, the Viking stealther class. The Shadow Walker is incredibly spooky and creepy and can increase a ton of panic rating on the enemies. They have the ability to pull enemy stealthers out of the veil and increase their panic rating and slow their movement speed at the same time. An incredibly powerful ability for group play and smaller scale RVR. They deal excellent disruption damage, but all of these cool utility things come at the cost of a bit of damage. In comparison to the other stealth classes, the Shadow Walker is a bit less focused on direct damage, and thus fills a little bit more of a supporty role. Speaking of support, the Skald, who we are told is quite good in melee, unlike the Minstrel and the Amadondu. Skalds have the ability to suppress the effects of wounds for their group members, and if a group member affected by this takes fatal damage, they will live on for a little bit and have the chance to be healed up again. This is an incredibly powerful RVR ability. because it gives a healer that last second he might need to save somebody. Skulls also have a little bit of a double whammy in being able to increase damage taken by enemies and also increase physical damage dealt by allies. Next up we have the Viking pet class, the Slaughter Wolf. Slaughter Wolves can deal slashing, fire and frost damage with their pets. Variety in damage types is always good because it gives you openings for when one of the damage types is resisted a lot. So that even on heavily armored targets that might not take as much slashing damage, you can still pump in with more fire and frost. Slaughter Wolves can debuff the enemy's preparation and recovery time, which is of course always great. Having your enemy cast longer and have longer cooldowns is amazing. They have the ability to reduce movement speed, and they might have some melee capabilities. We can't be entirely sure of this, but looking at the character art, we see a guy wearing medium armor and an axe. That to me kind of says that this guy likes to mix it up in melee every now and then. But I'm really just guessing at this point. Now the Stone Healer, we don't really know a lot of details as to what kind of heals they're gonna have, but I'm just going to assume that Stone Healers can heal and cure wounds because, well, they're the main healing class of the realm. The one cool thing we know about them is that they can cast their spells remotely through stones that they can place on the ground. This is immensely useful, of course, because it allows you to put down a stone around where your group members are fighting and then run around in circles while you're being chased and still cast those AoE heals right where they have to go. The Water Weaver fills the role of mage for the dastardly Vikings and deals, surprise, water damage. But presumably they're also going to deal ice damage. They can definitely knock back targets though and can slow their movement speed, and they can also reduce preparation and recovery times of enemies. From the presentation we know that the Water Weaver is also a little bit more on the supporty side, focusing not entirely on direct damage like the Flame Warden, or AoE weirdy nonsensicals like the Druid does. And then last but by absolutely no means least, we have the Winter's Shadow. And the Winter's Shadow can deal pretty damn good damage at both range and melee. It's a little bit more of a skirmish archer, and as such not entirely bound to just ranged attacks. They can deal high disruption damage with their arrows, and can increase preparation and recovery times of enemies while they are in melee with their mighty shield bashes. Oh yeah, I should have mentioned, the Winter Shadows can wear shields, making them also a little bit more tanky than the other archers. Alright then, let's have a look at some specific synergies. The Viking realm is a bit more cut and dry, with there being only really 3 major synergies, and no smaller interesting ones, just 3 really big ones. Namely survivability. The Skald and the Hailbound together can put out quite the impressive amount of defense, with the Hailbound reducing incoming damage on the team, and the Skald suppressing the effect of wounds on the target and keeping them alive for a little bit longer when they suffer that fatal damage. And this of course benefits the entire realm. There is no specific class that really benefits from this. It's a group effect, and as such the entire group benefits from it. And it is really quite good to have that much defense because the Vikings want to be really aggressive. And when you're being really aggressive, you kind of need that survivability because otherwise you rush in and die. And obviously nobody wants to do that. The second big one is physical damage. Surprise, surprise, the Vikings really love their melee combat. The Skald can increase damage taken by enemies, which is of course also good for magic, but at the same time the Skald can also increase the physical damage done by their party members. And that is only good for melee. And the increased damage is of course great for all the classes that do have some form of melee or physical combat in general, and that's of course the Skald, the Mjolnir, the Winter Shadow, the Shadow Walker, the Slaughter Wolf, and the Child of Loki. And then lastly, there is a little bit of a light control theme in the realm. And by light control I mean that there isn't really any hard control like knockouts, stuns, knockdowns, sleep effects, root effects, anything like that that really takes somebody out of the combat. But instead they have a lot of movement slow effects and preparation recovery time increasing effects. The Arisen, the Child of Loki, the Shadow Walker, the Slaughter Wolf, the Water Weaver, and the Winter Shadow all have one or both of these effects. Now for a realm that is so interested in melee combat, it is of course very important that you can keep your enemy where they are, so that you can get at them and then keep up with them. So having a lot of movement slowing effects is really, really good. And being aggressive in nature, you want to get in there and win on the damage side, so nerfing the enemy's cast speed and their cooldowns definitely throws them on the back foot. Now the 3 group setups I came up with are a little bit different than they were last time, because now we have confirmation that at the beginning of Beta 1 we will definitely have 8-man groups. So for this video I did choose to come up with some 8-man groups. So first up we have a melee group, and in that melee group I would personally put 2 Mjolnirs, a Child of Loki, a Skald, a Hailbound, a Stone Healer, a Shadow Walker, and an Arisen. The reason for that is that both the Mjolnirs, the Child of Loki and the Shadow Walker can absolutely benefit very well from the Skald's increased melee damage. The Skald is there, well, to increase melee damage and also to provide that survivability synergy with the Hailbound that I was talking about earlier. Having that higher survivability will allow the group to just go all out and go attack, 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 but still have the longevity to stick around even after the first shock wears off. For a melee group, it is very important to be the one that does the engaging, because a spell or ranged heavy group can fan out and kind of take the impact from a charge. But a melee group kind of has to get in there and start dealing their damage really quickly, because once the enemy group has fanned out, it is much more difficult to get to certain people in the enemy group quickly. And for that reason we have the Arisen, so that the group has enough scouting to know exactly where the enemies are and be able to engage them most of the time. The second setup is what I call a squishy attack setup. It has a lot more damage in 2 Child of Lokis, a Slaughter Wolf, a Winter Shadow, and we still run a Mjolnir, giving us a total of 5 offensive characters in this group. This setup gets rid of the Stone Healer in favor of having just the Hailbound and the Skald provide their defensive abilities and a tiny little bit of healing, just to stave everyone off while you rush in and do as much damage over a short amount of time as possible. For this reason we also have a Winter Shadow and a Water Weaver who can go in, deal their light control, slow everybody down, and then just quickly focus targets down, because pretty much every character here can do significant damage. This is of course a very squishy setup, and as such it doesn't do very well in drawn out fights. So this setup might for example not do especially well against a heavily armored melee group or a very long-term fighting Tuatha De Danann group with a bunch of Dullahans, but it probably does a little bit better against ranged and caster groups than the melee group would. And then lastly we have a control-heavy shock group. Every single bit of crowd control that the realm has is crammed into this one group. And the point of it is to make sure that everyone in the enemy group is slowed and has their recovery and preparation time screwed up, as well as a whole bunch of disruption damage and knockback, which can royally screw over their healer and make sure that you get your focus target down before he can even receive any healing. This sort of group aims to get 1 or 2 enemy characters down really quickly and then simply win on the numbers advantage. And you have to make good use of it. It requires a little bit better timing than some of the other groups, and it also requires a keen eye to spot which are the important targets in the enemy group. But if you can manage to get those 2 or 3 important targets down really quickly, then your simple numbers advantage and all your crazy debuffs and crowd control are going to win out over the longer fight. And that is it for the pointless speculation on class synergies. I hope you enjoyed this series and got a bit of a look at what I'm going to be doing when the game actually has content for me to check out and talk about. This sort of content is exactly what I will be doing once we have more information about the game, and I'm sure it'll be a pretty good time. But until then, I've been the CloakingDonkey, and I'll see you in another video.